"Get lost, old man." The words hit like a hammer. Arya's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the ornate hall like ice against glass. Her groom, standing nervously beside her, shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. Guests froze mid-laughter, their champagne glasses trembling in their hands. Darius, her father, tall and composed with a long grey beard, and eyes that had seen 7 decades of life, felt the sting but remained unmoved. Arya threw the insult with the kind of reckless pride that comes from ignorance and entitlement. Her voice echoed through the marble hall, bouncing off chandeliers and expensive decor, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. She glared at Darius as though her words could erase his years of dignity, erase his calm authority. Darius did not flinch. He did not yell back. He did not even tighten his jaw. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, retrieved his phone, and calmly tapped out a message, one short, cryptic line that only a select few could understand. The message was precise, almost surgical. No explanation, no threats, just a silent action that carried the weight of inevitability. Arya, fuming, spun around to face her groom, expecting support, some semblance of shared disdain for the man who had dared to raise her. Instead, she found him shifting uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. He glanced at her, then at Darius, and for the first time, hesitation flickered across his face. The room had grown tense. A low murmur swept through the guests, but nobody dared speak. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Darius's calmness was magnetic, almost suffocating in its intensity. Arya's anger boiled, her pride clashing with the quiet power her father projected. Her face flushed, hands trembling, eyes darting, searching for any sign of weakness. But there was none. Darius adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, straightened his posture, and walked toward the exit with measured steps. Every movement precise, deliberate. He did not glance back. His silence screamed louder than any shout. Arya's fingers clenched the edge of the table. Guests tried to resume normal conversation, but all eyes followed him, as if the room itself were under the spell of his quiet authority. He reached the grand double doors, paused for a moment, and without looking back, pressed send on his phone. The message vanished into the ether, a silent predator unleashed. Arya, still fuming, stomped toward him, intending to drag the confrontation further. But before she could take a single step, a commotion began at the rear of the hall. Her groom turned sharply, alarm flashing in his eyes. A series of whispered conversations and hurried steps rippled through the room. Guests gasped quietly, exchanging uneasy glances. The hair on the back of Arya's neck stood up. Something had shifted in the air, an invisible force she could not name. Her groom's usual smug confidence faltered as he looked toward the doors where Darius had disappeared from view moments ago. Panic glimmered faintly in his expression, a flicker so subtle that only those watching closely would have noticed. 20 minutes. That was all it took. 20 minutes for Arya's carefully constructed pride to crumble, for the life she thought secure to wobble. The groom's cell phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. He read the messages one after another, his face draining of color, disbelief and horror contorting his features, and then, as if unable to bear the weight of reality pressing down, he turned and ran straight out of the hall, leaving half the guests in stunned silence. Shoes scuffed against the polished floor, the echo loud and jarring, a sudden vacuum of chaos replacing the orchestrated celebration. Arya stood frozen, mouth open, incapable of processing the sudden unraveling of her world. Darius outside leaned against his car, silent. He watched the aftermath through the slightly tinted window, his expression calm, almost serene. The message had done its work, the lesson delivered without a single raised voice. Pride met its match in quiet strategy, arrogance humbled by patience and precision. The air was still heavy with tension, yet Darius's presence radiated a subtle power that made everyone aware of one undeniable truth. No insult could undo a lifetime of wisdom. No display of arrogance could pierce the calm of a man who had mastered silence. And in that moment, as Arya's voice faded into a whimper of disbelief and the groom's figure disappeared down the driveway, the first seeds of realization took root. A father's dignity, once tested, had shown its true weight. The hall was still trembling from the abrupt chaos. Guests whispered nervously, their laughter replaced by uneasy murmurs. Chandeliers sparkled faintly in the dimmed light, but the shimmer couldn't mask the tension that had settled like a heavy fog over the once celebratory scene. Arya stood frozen, her arms hanging limply by her sides, her nails digging faint crescents into her palms. Every detail of the hall, the polished floors, the gold-trimmed chairs, the overflowing floral arrangements, now seemed like an absurd stage for humiliation. Her groom, Trevor, had vanished. The staff whispered hurriedly among themselves, unsure whether he had gone to get help, or if he had simply bolted in panic. In truth, Trevor's mind was racing far faster than his legs. Each text Darius had sent struck like a hammer to the foundation of everything he had taken for granted. Numbers, legal warnings, subtle but undeniable consequences, all delivered in an almost invisible yet devastating sequence. Arya's rage shifted into disbelief. How could this happen in just 20 minutes? She muttered, voice trembling, more to herself than anyone else. She looked toward the grand doors through which her father had disappeared, a bitter fire lighting her eyes. The sight of Darius Harris, calm and composed outside in the driveway, only intensified her anger. He leaned casually against his black sedan, arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon with quiet authority, as if the world had always been under his control. The guests were now whispering openly. The whispers carried phrases like, "Did you see that?" His father. He didn't even raise his voice, and what kind of man is so calm? It was clear that Darius's silence and measured composure were making a far bigger impact than any words could have. For a fleeting moment, Arya felt exposed, stripped of the armor of pride she had worn so confidently. Inside the hall, the maid's trolley rattled as it was hurriedly pushed out of the room. Wine glasses trembled, flowers tilted precariously, and the hush of astonishment seemed to press down on every guest. Some clutched their champagne glasses, as if they could steady themselves against the invisible force of shame that now hovered over Arya. Meanwhile, Trevor had reached the edge of the driveway. His phone buzzed again. Another message, another piece of the carefully orchestrated puzzle Darius had sent. He froze, realizing the magnitude of the situation. The groom, who had always considered himself clever and capable, who had prided himself on smooth talk and charm, suddenly felt powerless. The foundations of his life, the trust, the security, the pride he had taken for granted, were trembling in ways he had never imagined. Darius remained calm, almost serene as he watched Trevor stumble backward. The groom's face was pale, eyes wide, hands trembling slightly as he realized that every attempt to regain control would fail. Darius didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to storm the hall, because in that moment, the gravity of his quiet authority did all the work. Inside, Arya's knees buckled slightly as realization hit. The carefully curated world she had thought she commanded, luxury, control, dominance over people and events, was nothing compared to the weight of wisdom and patience. Her father's quiet action had undone her arrogance in a way that shouting, fighting, or humiliation never could. Her pride was exposed, raw and aching. Outside, Trevor had collapsed onto the pavement, hands gripping his head, mouth opening in silent pleas. The spectators at the edges of the driveway could hardly believe their eyes. A man once confident and composed, now reduced to panic and confusion, all because of a single father's deliberate, silent action. Darius, still leaning casually against his car, pulled his phone from his pocket again. Another small measured tap, almost imperceptible, sent the final subtle shockwave through Trevor's crumbling composure. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't cruelty. It was the quiet precision of a man who understood how to deliver lessons that spoke louder than words. 20 minutes had passed since the insult, since the chaos had begun. And in that brief span, the arrogance of youth had collided with the calm authority of a lifetime of experience. Guests, once filled with curiosity, now watched in awe as the unfolding consequences painted a lesson they would remember forever. Arya's gaze shifted from Trevor, pale and shaking, to her father, the man who had endured decades of disrespect, who had suffered silently and yet remained unbroken. Her eyes filled with a mixture of fear, shock, and the faintest spark of understanding. The reality of the situation was undeniable. The man she had called old and dismissed was far more powerful than she had ever realized. The chaos, the whispers, the fear, and the collapse of confidence were not loud, flashy events. They were subtle, calculated, and devastating. And as Darius finally straightened, placing the phone back in his pocket, the room and the driveway seemed to hold their collective breath. The lesson had been delivered. Arya's anger had no target now. Trevor's panic had no remedy. Only Darius remained untouched, a figure of calm dignity in a world that had momentarily tilted violently toward humility and consequence. The day was far from over, and yet the first seeds of reckoning had been sown. Every glance, every whispered comment, and every trembling heartbeat in the hall echoed the truth. A father's silence, a single thoughtful action, could unravel pride and entitlement faster than any confrontation could. And outside, Trevor still trembled, caught in the grip of something he had never anticipated. The quiet, precise justice of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering patience, wisdom, and the devastating power of restraint. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows over the driveway where Trevor had collapsed moments ago. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he fumbled with his phone, trying to comprehend the messages from Darius. Each notification was a precise strike, dismantling privileges, accounts, and agreements that he had assumed were untouchable. The young groom, once full of confidence, now sat on the wet pavement, drenched in cold sweat, a faint drizzle coating his hair and shoulders. Arya hovered nearby, biting her lip, trying to mask her panic behind a thin veil of anger. She had expected her father's silence to intimidate her, but she hadn't anticipated the swift precision of his response. Trevor's world was unraveling faster than she could even process. The luxurious plans she had imagined, weddings, alliances, and control were dissolving, leaving only a stark, humiliating reality. Meanwhile, Darius remained calm, a figure of composed authority a few feet away, leaning lightly against his sleek black sedan. His long grey beard brushed against the collar of his jacket as he observed the scene, expression unreadable, eyes alert. He did not shout, he did not scold. He simply watched as the consequences of his calculated action took root, letting the universe, aided by his careful intervention, deliver the lesson. Trevor tried to stand, but his legs wobbled. His pride, once unshakable, now weighed him down. He looked at Arya, seeking support or sympathy, but she remained frozen, realization dawning harshly. Her father's single silent act had not only undone Trevor's sense of security, but also shaken her perception of herself. Arya's arrogance collided with the stark truth. Her father's calm intellect was far more formidable than she had ever imagined. The guests who had remained behind whispered in awe, careful not to intervene. Some peeked from behind curtains or through half-open doors, their expressions a mixture of fear, fascination, and deep respect. None could deny the magnetic pull of Darius's presence, the quiet command of authority, the subtle assurance that this was a man whose every action carried weight. Trevor's phone buzzed again. Another carefully timed notification arrived, revealing yet another consequence. This time it affected not just financial accounts, but social connections, legal obligations, and personal arrangements he had taken for granted. The cumulative effect was paralyzing. Each message acted like a domino, collapsing the structure of a life built on arrogance and entitlement. Arya's hands trembled. She stepped closer, hoping to somehow salvage the situation, but every movement she made seemed insignificant compared to the weight of Darius's calculated silence. She could feel the narrative of her life, and now Trevor's, being rewritten in real time. The room and driveway had become a stage for the unfolding of a lesson in humility, discipline, and consequence, orchestrated without a single raised voice. Trevor's eyes darted to the crowd of onlookers. The whispers had grown louder. Speculation spread like wildfire. Some guests tried to act normal, clearing glasses or adjusting flower arrangements, but every subtle movement drew attention back to the dramatic tableau unfolding before them. The groom's face was ashen, his composure fractured beyond repair, and then came the final nudge. Another text arrived, a single line: "Think before you act. Learn the cost of arrogance." It wasn't angry. It wasn't a threat. It was the quiet authority of a man who had long mastered the art of measured, devastating consequence. Trevor's hands fell to his knees as the weight of the message sank in. His eyes filled with tears, not of joy, not of relief, but of sudden, wrenching clarity. Arya finally spoke, her voice a whisper that barely carried over the murmur of the remaining guests. "Dad, how could you do this so fast?" Her pride had fractured, replaced by awe and fear. She was learning, albeit painfully, that control, arrogance, and entitlement were fragile when confronted with patience, intelligence, and strategic silence. Darius finally walked closer, his posture relaxed but commanding. The drizzle slicked the driveway, reflecting the morning sunlight and creating shimmering patterns on the pavement. He stopped a few feet from Trevor, his eyes softening just slightly. "Lessons are not given lightly," he said, voice low but firm. "You will remember this day for the rest of your life. Let it shape you." Trevor tried to speak but could only manage a croak of disbelief. Words failed him entirely. Arya's eyes met her father's, and she realized for the first time the magnitude of wisdom that came from decades of measured patience. By now, the crowd had begun to disperse, leaving only those who could witness the full impact of the lesson. The atmosphere was heavy with awe and subtle fear, punctuated by the occasional creak of the doors or shuffle of footsteps on the polished driveway. Darius's calm demeanor had not only neutralized a situation that could have escalated violently, but had also instilled a lasting sense of respect and fear in all who had observed. Trevor slumped fully onto the driveway, hands covering his face. His life, once ordered around pride, entitlement, and arrogance, had been dismantled in 20 minutes by a man who refused to engage with anger. Arya stood beside him, her hands pressed against her mouth, realizing that humiliation, shock, and fear could teach lessons more powerfully than any argument or reprimand. Darius turned and began walking back to his car, long grey beard brushing lightly across his chest. Every step he took radiated quiet authority, reminding the witnesses of a simple truth. Power is not always in the voice that shouts. Sometimes it lies in the silence that commands. And in that moment, as Trevor's sobs echoed faintly and Arya's realization settled deep within her, the first real shift occurred. Pride, arrogance, and ignorance had met their match. The consequences of a life built on entitlement were now being felt in a tangible, unforgettable way. A lesson delivered with precision, dignity, and timeless authority. By late afternoon, the air had cleared of rain, leaving the driveway glistening and reflecting the golden hue of the sinking sun. Trevor, still kneeling in shock, could feel the weight of every moment since his father's silent intervention. His breathing was uneven, ragged, and his hands trembled as he pressed them into the wet pavement, trying to regain some sense of control that had been ripped from him in mere minutes. Arya hovered nearby, conflicted emotions fighting within her. Anger, shame, disbelief, and a flicker of understanding wrestled in her chest. She had always considered herself in control, the orchestrator of events in her life, the clever one. Yet in the span of 20 minutes everything had crumbled. Her father Darius had not raised a hand, had not shouted, had not embarrassed her in public, yet he had done far more damage than her own fits of pride could have inflicted. The lesson was undeniable, arrogance was fragile, and quiet authority was infinitely more powerful than outward displays of control. Trevor finally attempted to rise, but his legs betrayed him, weak and unsteady from the emotional onslaught. His pride, the armor he had carried for years, lay shattered at his feet. He glanced at Arya, desperately seeking reassurance or solidarity, but found only a mirrored reflection of his own vulnerability. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Eyes wide with a dawning realization, Darius had retreated a short distance, leaning casually against his sleek black sedan, long grey beard catching the late sunlight. Every movement was calm, deliberate, and full of purpose. His presence alone radiated authority. There was no need for confrontation. The silence itself carried the weight of consequence, suffocating and compelling in its precision. Arya finally found her voice, but it was small, almost a whisper. "Dad, what just happened? How could you?" Darius did not rush to explain. Instead, he slowly approached the wrought iron gate where the note he had left earlier fluttered faintly in the light breeze. The message was simple yet devastating in its precision. Every action has its cost. Pride blinds, patience sees. Trevor's face drained of color as he read the words again, feeling them pierce deeper with each glance. He realized that this was no ordinary reprimand, no impulsive retaliation. It was a carefully orchestrated lesson, delivered with surgical precision. Darius had taken control not through anger, but through timing, strategy, and a deep understanding of human nature. Arya's shoulders sagged as she took in the full impact of her father's approach. For the first time, she saw him not as the old man she had mocked, but as a force of patience, wisdom, and quiet power. Every boast, every assumption she had held about life, control, and dominance now seemed naive, almost childish in comparison. Trevor tried to speak, but words failed him. He shook his head, shoulders trembling, and the ground beneath him seemed to echo the lesson's weight. Arya stepped closer, tentatively reaching for his arm, unsure whether she should comfort or scold. Both of them were learning, painfully, sharply, that life's lessons often came from the most unexpected, silent places. Darius straightened, hands clasped lightly behind his back, and finally broke his silence. "You have both had a glimpse today," he said, voice calm, deliberate, and carrying the weight of decades. "It is not anger that teaches. It is understanding, observation, and the consequences of your actions. Let this guide your choices going forward." The air felt heavy, almost sacred, as the words sank in. Guests who had returned from their initial shock now watched silently, understanding that they had witnessed more than an emotional confrontation. They had seen a masterclass in authority, humility, and controlled power, a lesson that could not be forgotten. Trevor finally lifted his head, his eyes wet, shoulders trembling, as he swallowed hard. Arya mirrored his posture, shame and awe mixing on her young face. Neither spoke for a long moment. The silence was potent, filled with reflection and the slow dawning of understanding. Darius turned, glancing briefly at the driveway, then at the fading sunlight reflecting off the polished floor. His long grey beard swayed slightly with the motion, and a subtle smile crept across his face. He had delivered the lesson, measured and precise, without the need for confrontation, shouting, or humiliation. The consequences had begun to unfold. The arrogance of youth was tempered, pride was humbled, and the first seeds of respect unearned, not demanded, but were taking root. The lesson was indelible, carried not in words alone but in action, timing, and the unshakable authority of a father who understood the subtle art of influence. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the driveway, Arya and Trevor remained kneeling, shaken and subdued. Darius's figure stood calm and commanding, a living testament to the truth that patience and wisdom could topple pride faster than anger ever could. And somewhere, in that silent, tense atmosphere, a realization began to crystallize in both children. Life would never again be the same, because the power of quiet authority had revealed itself fully, painfully, and irrevocably. The driveway had become a battlefield of quiet devastation. Trevor sat slumped against the curb, his chest heaving, hands shaking uncontrollably as he stared at the note Darius had left on the gate. Each carefully crafted word had dismantled him, stripped him of the arrogance he had clung to for years, and left him exposed to the raw reality of consequence. His pride, once impenetrable, had crumbled like brittle glass under the weight of calculated, silent authority. Arya hovered beside him, her own composure frayed. She had watched her father, Darius, not yell, not scold, not even look angry, yet the results had been catastrophic. Her groom, who had imagined himself clever and untouchable, was now reduced to trembling, desperate pleas. Arya's chest tightened as she realized the full scale of her father's mastery. Darius did not need to fight, to argue, or to assert dominance in the conventional sense. His wisdom, patience, and quiet power were more devastating than any outburst could ever be. The guests who had lingered returned to their homes slowly, whispers of awe and fear following them. Some stopped to glance at the scene, unable to tear their eyes away from the father, whose calm had undone years of pride in mere minutes. Stories of arrogance meeting patience would be repeated for years, but no one could quite describe the exact way Darius had achieved it, only that it had happened. Trevor tried to lift his head, but the words caught in his throat. His phone buzzed again, another subtle message from Darius detailing consequences that extended beyond mere embarrassment. Accounts were frozen, appointments cancelled, and privileges revoked in a manner so precise it was almost surgical. Each notification drove home the lesson. Actions, no matter how arrogant, always have a cost, and those who fail to anticipate it invite ruin. Arya's mind raced as she processed the reality. Every insult, every gesture of pride, every moment she had attempted to assert superiority over her father now seemed laughably insignificant. Yet she could not laugh. Shame burned deep in her chest, mingled with a dawning understanding that she had underestimated the power of patience and strategic restraint. Meanwhile, Darius remained a calm, commanding figure, leaning against his black sedan, long grey beard swaying gently with the breeze. He didn't need to intervene further. The storm he had set in motion was self-sustaining. Pride and arrogance were collapsing under the weight of calculated consequences, and the lesson he had delivered through silence, timing, and a single note was unfolding exactly as he had intended. Trevor's body trembled as he attempted to stand. His movements were shaky, uncertain, each step betraying the inner turmoil that raged within him. Arya watched helplessly as her groom, once brash and confident, staggered toward the street, fully realizing the gravity of his failures. She wanted to speak, to console, to redirect the devastation, but even she recognized that nothing could undo what had been set in motion. The note, still pinned to the gate, fluttered slightly in the wind, a simple white rectangle, carrying the weight of undeniable authority. It read, "Actions define respect. Disregard carries cost. Learn quickly or be undone." Its brevity was deceptive. The impact was crushing. It was not a threat. It was a declaration, a surgical lesson delivered with precision. Arya's realization deepened as she saw the final toll of arrogance. Trevor collapsed fully to the driveway, head in his hands, sobs breaking free in uncontrollable waves. Humiliation, fear, and newfound understanding mingled, leaving no room for denial. She approached him cautiously, but there was nothing she could do to repair the damage, only witness it, absorb it, and recognize the truth of her father's mastery. Darius straightened, walking slowly toward the gate. His eyes scanned both Arya and Trevor, assessing the subtle shifts in emotion. There was no anger in his gaze, only the unshakable calm of a man who had seen decades of pride, arrogance, and human folly. His long grey beard framed a face that radiated both patience and quiet authority. He exuded a presence so powerful that even the afternoon breeze seemed to pause, the world itself bending subtly to acknowledge the weight of his restraint. Trevor's sobs finally stilled, replaced by silent despair. Arya sank beside him, fingers clutching the damp driveway as tears spilled freely. The lesson was complete. Arrogance destroyed itself when confronted with intelligence, patience, and measured consequence. Pride met its match in a father who had mastered the art of subtle, devastating authority. By the time the sun dipped lower, the world outside the driveway had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet the microcosm of devastation within the gates remained vivid. Trevor and Arya had learned something irreversible, a lesson delivered without cruelty, without violence, but with surgical precision and unwavering dignity. Darius finally turned toward his car, adjusting his jacket, long grey beard swaying gently. He glanced back at the driveway, at the kneeling figures of his daughter and son-in-law, and allowed a faint, satisfied smile to cross his face. The chaos, the collapse of arrogance, and the deep, unshakable lesson had all unfolded exactly as intended. This was not vengeance. It was not cruelty. It was justice measured with patience, precision, and dignity. And as the shadows lengthened across the driveway, the power of silence and strategic restraint had etched a lesson into the hearts of those who had witnessed it, a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. The early morning sun cast a soft golden glow across the driveway, illuminating every detail of the scene, like a stage set for the final act of reckoning. Trevor, once brimming with arrogance and overconfidence, remained kneeling, head bowed, hands pressed to his face. Arya sat beside him, shoulders trembling, eyes red from tears that had fallen freely in the night. The events of the past hours had dismantled their sense of control, leaving them raw, vulnerable, and painfully aware of the weight of consequence. Darius approached slowly, every step measured, every movement deliberate. His long grey beard swayed lightly with the morning breeze, and the quiet strength of his presence seemed to anchor the world around him. He carried no anger, no malice, only the unshakable calm of a man who had seen the arrogance of youth and dismantled it with patience and precision. The driveway, littered with remnants of scattered invitations, toppled flower petals and footprints, bore silent witness to the collapse of pride and entitlement. He stopped a few feet away from the kneeling figures, letting the silence stretch and thrum with intensity. The world seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the final words, the concluding gesture that would seal the lesson once and for all. Trevor lifted his head slightly, eyes wide, brimming with a mixture of shame and fear. Arya, her pride humbled and her perception forever altered, mirrored his gaze, the weight of understanding settling into her bones. Darius crouched just enough to meet their eyes, voice low, resonant and deliberate. The measure of a person is not in their victories over others, but in their humility when faced with consequence. Learn this or be undone. Remember this day. His words were calm, yet each syllable landed with the force of inevitability. No shouting, no threats, just the immutable weight of truth delivered with dignity. Trevor's body trembled as realization struck fully. His life, once carefully curated and controlled, had been exposed as fragile and susceptible to collapse. The arrogance he had wielded like a shield had become a liability, and every attempt to regain control felt futile. He finally lowered his hands, letting them rest on his knees. Unable to meet his father's unwavering gaze, Arya, meanwhile, let a shuddering breath escape, the fight between anger and awe within her dissolving into clarity. She had always believed she understood the rules of power and influence, but she now saw how little she truly knew. Her father's quiet strategy had undone what shouting, pleading, or bargaining never could. Her world and the Groom's had shifted irreversibly in a span of minutes. From his car, Darius's phone buzzed again, another subtle nudge of consequences being finalized. Accounts frozen, appointments cancelled, alliances disrupted. Every action calculated, every domino falling exactly as intended. Yet Darius did not gloat. He had no need. The lesson had been delivered, the equilibrium restored, and justice served not through violence or vindictiveness, but through intelligence, timing, and restraint. Trevor finally stumbled to his feet, legs weak, knees quaking. He glanced at Arya, then at his father, and the enormity of his errors pressed down like a physical weight. The humiliation, the fear, the sudden exposure of vulnerability. It was all irrevocable. He swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. "Dad, I understand." Arya, her own pride tempered and recalibrated, approached her father cautiously. Her voice, soft and reverent, carried the acknowledgement of the lesson learned. I see now, Dad, I see everything." Darius nodded slightly, a faint smile tracing his lips. His long grey beard shifted with the motion, reflecting the sunlight and the quiet authority he exuded. The driveway was no longer a place of chaos, but of resolution. Arya and Trevor had faced the consequences of their arrogance, had been humbled, and now carried a deep, indelible respect for the man who had guided them, not with force but with precision, patience, and unwavering dignity. The guests who had lingered watched in awe from behind the gates. They had borne witness not to anger, not to confrontation, but to the power of quiet authority and measured justice. Every detail, the dripping rain from the previous night, the scattered petals, the trembling figures, would remain etched in memory as a testament to the lesson delivered. As the morning settled fully, Darius turned, adjusting his jacket, long grey beard swaying lightly, and walked toward his car. He glanced back one last time, eyes meeting Arya's and Trevor's. No words were spoken, but the silence spoke volumes. Respect, understanding, and the knowledge that arrogance would always be tempered by wisdom had been firmly instilled. Trevor sank fully to his knees, sobs breaking free. His life transformed irrevocably in the wake of a father's calculated intervention. Arya clutched his arm, tears streaming down her face, her pride reshaped into reverence. Darius slid into his car, the engine humming softly, the long shadow of his figure stretching across the driveway. Outside, the world continued its rhythm, oblivious to the intimate yet profound drama that had unfolded. And within the walls of the estate, one truth remained eternal: a father's patience, dignity, and long-cultivated wisdom could dismantle pride, command respect, and deliver justice more effectively than anger ever could. The driveway was quiet now, the lesson complete. The silence spoke of authority, consequence, and the irreversible transformation of those who had underestimated the weight of restraint. The poetic justice had been delivered, silently, inevitably, and irrevocably.